I'd like to introduce our two presenters. Today we've got Scott Giordano, the VP of Data Protection at Spirion, and Frank Ramos, our Senior Solution Engineer. So Scott, take it away.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Shane. If you want to advance the next slide, that would be great. And then again. So I want to welcome everyone to our presentation today. I'm really very happy to be able to do this. We're going to talk about data classification and how it really has become a Swiss Army knife for privacy and security compliance. I'll talk about the big picture. Frank will do a presentation on how it works in practice, and we really want to get your questions. Send them in early and often, and we'll answer them as they come in. We'll also leave some time towards the end for answering questions. So if you leave with nothing else, Shane, if you go to the next slide, I want you to leave with a couple things. One is that information security and data privacy laws and regulations are constantly being passed into law and are converging into what I call data protection. Data protection is its own discipline. Last year, we had about 14 or so new laws here in the U.S. at the state level. Just in the first half of this year, we have about 19 or so new ones. And we just had a new one passed last week. That's the New York Shield Act. So they're rolling in with regularity. Even if they don't affect you directly, they often do so indirectly, and that's typically via a contract. So perhaps you're handling the data for a client that is subject to these laws. It could be GDPR, it could be California's law, it could be New York's. But in many cases, even if you're not directly implicated, you are indirectly. Data classification, a powerful way to address a wide variety of data protection compliance requirements. So think of it as a Swiss Army knife for compliance. And as we go along here, you'll see just all the great things it can do. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll start digging in to this. What this is, and I know it's a bit of an eye chart, so I forgive us for this, but this is a collection of the laws that were passed last year. So there's about 14 or so laws that were passed last year. And by the way, a copy of this will be made available to all of you after the presentation is over. So this is a summary of what happened last year. And you can see there's all kinds of things going on here that you probably weren't apprised of. Many of which were data breach notification. Some were addressing sale of data. Some were addressing things entirely different. So this is a great example of just some of the laws that happened in 2018. And yes, there will be a follow-up for 2019 as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is the convergence of data security and privacy obligations. Most of these laws will have a centricity of either privacy or security, but then they'll also have the opposites mandates as well. So for example, GDPR tends to be privacy centric. So the idea of being able to meet data subject rights like access, correction, erasure, etc., but it also has security obligations. So technical organizational controls to protect personal data. CCPA is very similar. It's a privacy-centric law, but then also has security obligations. Much like GDPR does, you have to maintain reasonable security procedures and practices. NYDFS, which many of you are probably subject to, is security-centric. So it talks about things like identifying risks, using so-called defensive infrastructure, etc. But it also asks for a privacy element and the idea of the CISO considering, to the extent possible, confidentiality of non-public information. What is non-public information? Well, if you look to your left in the leftmost column, it's the definition of sensitive information. So that's things like a social security number, an access number, HIPAA data, or what we call business-related information. So think about trade secrets. Trade secrets are sensitive information. Once they're out for good. You can't get them back. You can't unring the bell. That's why it's so important to preserve them, because once they're gone, you lose the trade secret status and the whole planet knows it effectively. So essentially, all of these obligations that you're seeing in privacy and security, they're centric to privacy or security, but as a practical matter, they're all one idea. They're this idea of data protection. Go to the next slide. We'll continue on this road here. So there's a big challenge in finding sensitive data. And when I talk about sensitive data, I just alluded to this idea of trade secrets. So we have personal information, however defined, and it's defined very broadly, especially with CCPA. It's shocking how many things are personal information under CCPA. It seems like there's more things that are personal that are not. Trade secrets, I mentioned earlier why they're so sensitive. Also, attorney-client privileged information is much in the same boat. If you lose attorney-client privileged information, you lose the privilege. That is to say that the communication that your client gave to you, if it's disclosed to third parties and it shouldn't have been, then that privilege is gone. So that's why it's so fragile. And also there's this idea of confidential communications. Perhaps you're making some kind of a statement on email to someone else. And maybe it's not necessarily a trade secret, but it's something that could be embarrassing if the public knew about it, if it wound up on the New York Times. So that's considered sensitive as well. And the challenge we face is that many of you on the call are familiar with pattern matching, whether it's regex or grep or whatever you want to call it. Pattern matching is great. It's been around for a very long time. Problem is that because of the changing nature of sensitive data, it's only going to take you so far. If data appears in a non-pattern, if it appears just in words proximity to one another, for example, it's not going to really fit that idea of a pattern, and so pattern matching only takes you so far. And there's also this issue of what's sensitive. Well, it's very subjective nowadays. Before it was easier. You said, okay, great, a social security number is personal information, or it's sensitive information, or a driver's license number, or what have you. But now it's much more subjective. You look at GDPR. GDPR has a series of things that we probably would scratch our head about. Special data. So trade union membership, for example, is considered special data. There's special restrictions on it, which you would think, gee, that's kind of unusual. That's how they treat it, though, over in the EU. Your political philosophies are considered sensitive. So a lot of things that you may not necessarily think about as sensitive data are sensitive. And that idea has now come back to the U.S. under CCPA. For example, protected classes. So Title VII, folks are protected by Title VII of U.S. Code. That is now considered personal information. So you see how it's come full circle here. Let's go to the next slide. Talk about data discovery. I'm going to do a very simplistic view of data discovery because Frank's going to go into some depth on this. But if we talk about data discovery, it's an automated, purpose-built process for locating responsive information. And I use responsive in quotes here because think about in litigation, whenever you're being asked to produce data that's responsive to a certain topic or a certain idea, it's very much the same principle here. It's responsive to perhaps contractual requirements. You have to find certain kind of data that is subject to the terms of a contract, and you have to find it within your own information system. Or perhaps it's responsive because of a law of HIPAA or GLBA or high-tech or what have you. But it is a discipline in and of itself. It's not simply a task that you approach and it's one and done. I get a lot of questions about, well, is data discovery the same thing as e-discovery? And can I use e-discovery tools for data discovery? And the answer is no, not really. E-discovery is really geared towards litigation, into locating documents in particular, documents that are the smoking gun document, the document that says we're not going to sell to so-and-so because of some illegal means, or hey, let's all bid on a certain topic or a certain contract and let's not bid underneath this number. So looking for the smoking gun document that's going to prove your case. Maybe 4 to 8 documents in an entire discovery process are going to be relevant to that idea. So data discovery is not e-discovery. That's very litigation-centric. Regular data discovery, again, it's responsive to laws and regulations and other things. Data discovery is not file classification. I get that question sometimes. File classification, how many PDFs do you have on this hard drive, or how many .docs do you have on this hard drive? That's not what this is about. That's a species of information governance, and that's not really what data discovery is all about. And then finally, is data discovery DLP? Is it data loss prevention? No, it's not. Data loss prevention is a mechanism for looking at traffic going through a network and making a decision as to how you're going to treat that traffic. Effectively, data discovery becomes brains for that DLP, but it is not DLP. They're two separate, distinct mechanisms, if you will. And then finally, data discovery versus other search methods. I've spent a good chunk of my career either with Boolean searches, because as a lawyer, you have to become very well versed with that, or with regex. I spent some time in forensics. You have to be very good with regex. Those are great. They have a lot of value, but they simply are not enough. You can't rely just on those and be able to be complete in whatever you're trying to do, in this case, data protection. Go to the next slides, Shane, and then I'm going to do a full stop. Shane, do we have any questions that have come in thus far?
Yes, we do.
Let's fire them off.
All right. How is PCI DDS data handled through CCPA?
The best way to, if you want to talk about that Venn diagram, one of the things that's interesting about CCPA is that it also covers commercial transactions. So you could make the argument that anything that has to do with a commercial transaction, so the records of that transaction, are going to be covered by CCPA as well. So perhaps you've gone onto an e-commerce site and you've looked at things and you've clicked on ads and you've bought something and supplied information. Yes, I know that they're typically going to pull you away from that site onto a secure gateway that's going to address the track 2 data, track 1 data. So that's the overlap. It's not a huge overlap, but it is an overlap. So to the degree that you're already meeting that requirement under PCI DSS, then you've met that piece of it under CCPA. Again, it's a very tiny piece. CCPA has a huge definition of personal data, but that's where that Venn diagram overlaps. And Frank, certainly if you want to opine on this, feel free to. Okay, I'll take that as a no. Shane, other questions?
Nope, that's it.
That's it?
Just a
Okay.
later reminder to everyone, you can type your questions into the GoToWebinar console at any time.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to set up the idea of data classification, and then Frank's going to present on it. So this idea of data classification, again, this is a process. It's not a one and done. It's a process of analyzing a document or record and then applying a label that indicates who can access it, how it should be protected, how long it should be retained, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, you can think of this as a species of information governance, but it's really narrowly focused to making sure that all of the relevant obligations, whether it's driven by law or by contract or just by a best practice, are accounted for. It's a process because it involves 4 pieces. It has the regulations. So at 30,000 feet, you get a regulation or some other mandate. That begets a policy, which then begets expectations. And those expectations are controlled by controls. So the last 3 of these, the policies, expectations, controls, develop over time. And they're implemented over time, and they're refined over time. So that's the idea of this being a process, and I'll visualize this in just a bit. It has to be repeatable, it has to be defensible. That way, whenever something goes wrong, you're in court or you're before a regulatory authority, like what we saw last week where we had several regulatory authorities weighing in on Equifax and on Facebook. So being able to make this process repeatable and defensible, showing that what you did was reasonable under the circumstances. And I emphasize the word reasonable. It does not have to be perfect. It has to be reasonable. There's always a lawyer. This is something that the former security director of a place I used to work at used to tell me all the time, because everything that he was working on from an information security standpoint had a legal aspect. And so I spent probably an hour a day in his office just going over legalities of everything, whether it was a contract or whether it was a mandate by the government or by a business partner. He would love to say there's always a lawyer, and he was right. There's always a lawyer involved in this. There's always some kind of legal aspect to this. Let's go to the next slide. So why data classification? Because it answers a lot of very hard questions. It answers what do you have in terms of sensitive information? Where is it? Who has access to it? How is it controlled? How is it retained and disposed of? So I mentioned earlier about this idea of creating consistency. This is crucial. This is how you get up the chain on a CMM scale. Most folks that I work with are maybe on 1.5 on the CMM scale, and they want to maybe get to a 3. That kind of consistency is what's going to get you there, because you have a very good idea of how everything should be addressed from an information governance standpoint as applied to sensitive information. So it enables you to justify and prioritize controls. You can say, okay, based upon what we know that these controls versus these other ones are most important. Many of you are probably going through a process of getting your ISO 27K, which is a 3-year process looking forwards. And so you want to know what controls you need to prioritize to get you there. This is the kind of intelligence you can get with data classification to help give you the guidance you need. If there's a breach, there's an internal investigation, it's going to help you prioritize your efforts. You can get an idea very quickly of what information is in scope, what's implicated, and making sure that you're documenting that, because typically an attorney general or the FTC or someone's going to want to know that. Let's go to the next slide. The data classification components, there's 4 big components to this, and you may have seen this before. I may have presented this to you before, but it bears repeating. There's the matrix, or the schema, sometimes we'll call it that. That is the raw information of what gets connected to what in terms of controls to information. There's a policy, meaning that the organization says, as a policy, you will follow this or you will get fired. If you can't be punished for violating it, it's not a policy. Tools are the things that we're going to show you today, specifically how it works in action. And then monitoring and audit means that you're looking at this backwards, maybe after a year, and saying, okay, did it really catch all the things that it's supposed to catch? Is it effective? Those of you familiar with SOX, already familiar with this idea that you have to look at the efficacy of your controls. No different here. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll show you the matrix or the schema. And so
Scott,
the
I
way
actually
I
have a
developed this.
question.
Yep, sure, throw it in.
Okay. Is it correct that only a human can detect 100% of sensitive data, and the system can only give this info with some kind of probability?
Yes, but I'm going to do a qualified yes, because
Okay.
here's the problem when you say that only a human can do it. If I gave a document to 10 different humans and I said, classify this as to what you think it's going to be, you're probably going to get 11 different answers. And this is based on my own experience, that yes, humans can definitively say what's sensitive data, but it still has to be with reference to a standard. And I'll give you a great example. And this is a real life example, happened to me when I worked as a defense contractor, and from which I developed what you're seeing here, is this idea that, well, I think a certain kind of document, even though it's controlled by the ITAR, it's not going to be class 5, it's going to be class 4 because the nature of what's in it. And someone may look at that and say, no, I disagree. It's got to be class 5, and therefore it merits certain controls. You could have that debate with the same piece of information. And so, yeah, only a human can say definitively something sensitive, but that doesn't really help you very much, because suppose you disagree as to what degree of sensitivity it is, then you're back to square one, saying, well, what do we do with it? What kind of protections does it get? Do we default to the most restrictive or something less? So the net of it is yes, that's true, but it doesn't help you very much. You still need to be able to refer it to a larger standard.
And Scott, I'm just going to jump in here for a second, because you actually said something earlier which really aligns to that question, which is when we're dealing with internal, my organization, my rules, that's one challenge. But with regards to oversight and regards to regulation, you actually said it pretty clear: reasonable effort. They're not looking for perfection. So, when you put that in the grand scheme of that particular question, which was, can a human be 100% accurate? That's subjective, just because you can hand it to 10 people and get 11 answers. But the fact of the matter is that as long as you put that reasonable effort in, and in our tool, we sit somewhere around 2% or less, depending on some fine tuning as far as accuracy goes. As long as they're putting that reasonable effort in, that's going to also keep them out of trouble when dealing with that. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely, yeah. Having less than 2% false positives, which is what you're referring to, yes, absolutely. That's
that and the reasonable effort. And making for reasonable effort.
But it goes to a larger issue of what qualifies as reasonable. And here's a great story. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I think it bears listening to, is that I got a question from a customer that said, well, what is the national standard for the number of false positives you can get away with having in your system, or the number of documents or pieces of information that you miss? And what that person was asking for is much like what the EPA would say: you could only have so many parts per million of this carcinogen, otherwise you can't have, people can't drink this water or something. Those things don't exist right now. I'm glad the EPA has that for carcinogens. We don't have that yet. We're just not there. But what you can do is ask yourself at a 30,000 foot level, what does my industry say? And we've got plenty of documents for industries. You think about all the NIST documents and all the ISO documents and all these things that are specific to certain industries. That's really where the consensus is, and that's the closest we have at this point to what qualifies as reasonable. We've got a long way to go, but yes, that's exactly to your point about just what qualifies. Okay. Let's talk about data classification schemas. So what you're seeing here, and again, this is something I developed some years ago when I was at a defense contractor. This is a much smaller piece of a much larger document, but in essence, what we're asking is, what's the severity of the consequences of mishandling it? Is it significant? Is it likely? Is it unlikely? Okay, great. And then from there, we say, well, what kinds of information would give that? Well, if you lost a contract, maybe with someone you didn't want to know everyone else to know that you had a contract with this vendor, okay, that could be significant adverse impact. Well, then that's class 3. I've labeled it yellow. That includes things like personally identifiable information under the U.S. or things that are personal data under non-U.S. standards, so things of that nature. And then what does that beget? Well, it begets certain controls. You access only to certain individuals or groups. You include appropriate notices. You can Within those groups, make as many copies as you want, but if it's on paper, it has to be in a locked cabinet when not in use. And if we go to the next slide, I've really broken this up by media. So for example, you'll see that we'll go down to web portals. So transmission is prohibited unless it's encrypted using an approved method by the Data Classification Committee or Data Protection Committee. So we had a committee made up of people from all across the company that weighed in on what qualifies as a correct encryption standard. So this all begs the question about who controls all this. It's that committee, and they create these standards, and then this gets formed into policy. So you can see how this process works. If it is email within a company versus something that's sent outside the company, then again, no transmission unless there's appropriate controls in place, like data classification, for preventing things from leaving the network that shouldn't, etc. So that's why we have this kind of a matrix, so you have an idea of what the standards are. And if we go to the next slide.
I actually have a question, Scott.
Sure.
Is HIPAA data excluded from CCPA? And could you please comment about the employee information that's associated with respect to CCPA?
Yes, HIPAA information is excluded from CCPA per se. However, and this is a big however, that doesn't mean that you're not still subject to CCPA. So if you're a medical institution, great, you've got a get out of jail free card essentially, because HIPAA data is excluded from CCPA. Here's the problem, is that CCPA also covers all kinds of other things. So say that you have a prospective patient that's using your website and they're putting in their personal information to that and they're signing up for marketing newsletters and things like that. That's all covered by CCPA. So even though the pure HIPAA data, okay, and if you look at the NIST documents that covers HIPAA, they go into great depth about what qualifies, and DHSS has also a document on what qualifies as HIPAA data. That's great. Problem is that if you're a medical institution in California, you have employees, they're covered by CCPA. So all of their data is covered. All their HR data is covered. So I know there's some amendments floating around in this state legislature trying to do away with that, but right now it's still considered employee data, still considered subject to CCPA. So yes, they're correct. HIPAA data is not covered, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. Same thing for Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Okay, so financial data that's covered for banks, not covered by or exempted, if you will, by CCPA. But if you're engaging in other things that are outside of that, absolutely it's covered. And yes, employees in financial institutions, same thing. Their employee data is covered. So don't presume that just because you're a bank, you're a hospital, you're not covered by CCPA. At this point, you may well be.
Thanks.
Other questions, Shane, or are we?
Nope, that's
good.
That's it.
Okay. So on this final slide here, you're going to see that we have, again, different media. So audio, web conferencing. Add to if you look at yellow column, add to the file metadata a P3 designation. So that way that as that travels through the network, DLP reads that, or next-gen firewalls read that, or anything else that reads that label, as Frank's going to show you in a minute, we'll see that P3 designation, and so on and so forth. So the net of it is that this matrix is crucial for everyone to understand exactly what the standard is and how to adhere to the standard. And if you violate the standard, then presumably you would get punished. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a true policy. That's a data classification matrix in a nutshell. Again, I spent probably 9 months developing this source, big one that this one is a subset of. So it takes a while because you have to get consensus. If everyone isn't on the board, it's going to fail. That's a data classification matrix or schema. Are there questions or comments on that, Shane, before we go on?
No.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to do a little bit more. Okay, so data discovery and classification action. I'm going to hand this over to Frank in just a minute, but I want to talk about data privacy or data protection, as we now call it. So if you go to the next slide, Shane, I'm going to just give a brief discussion, and then Frank should be taking over. So personal data is almost everywhere. And just as a general rule, and I'm not being glib when I say this, if it's powered by electricity, it probably produces personal information. And you think, oh, that's ridiculous. It's not. You think about all the things powered by electricity that can be connected to the internet. Your car, powered by, well, primarily gasoline, but you also have electricity in there as well. It's producing data. For example, it has its version of a flight data recorder that presumably you can find, you can get access to in court. Your routers, that's got all kinds of personal information, and basically anything that's powered by electricity probably produces personal information, especially online identifiers. So things produced by devices, applications, tools, and protocols. I pulled that out of GDPR. Think about IP addresses, MAC addresses, cookies, IMEIs, IMSI numbers, UDIDs, all these things. This is all personal information by GDPR, by CCPA, and many of the other data protection regulations have come down the pike. And so with that, Frank, would you dig a little bit deeper into this and show the audience just exactly how this works in practice?
Sure. Can we go ahead and just advance to the next slide, Shane? I want to start at the beginning there. Oh, I think you passed it off a little bit too quick here. Hang on one second. There we go.
I was very eager to pass it on. All right. You see it?
No, Shane, you may have to click the play icon.
There we go.
So really, in order to explain a little bit further about how we have classify, we have to talk a little bit about the accuracy. And I had made a little mention earlier about some of the things that we do and how we get to that 2% false positive starts with something called an AnyFind. Now, that is our internal trademark fancy word for our intellectual property, which is something that we are constantly working on. It started 12 years ago here, or actually 13 years ago, and here we are today. So on the screen that you're looking at here in this particular shot, essentially the idea is if we're going to search data, we want to mitigate false positives. And the way we do that is through proximity sensors and taking it to a level beyond just simple pattern matching, as Scott had mentioned a little bit earlier. So if you look on the left-hand side of the screen where you see that 555-444 number that passes the Lund and Bankman test, that's going to come up as a false positive in pattern matching. Same thing for that 4012-1881 number. That's a test card. And that's great for testing systems to make sure they get off through. But the reality is when we're trying to reduce data and we're trying to reduce the footprint of target data, for breaches, things like that, in that arena, false positives aren't going to do us any favors. Just below that portion, if you look where it says in big red letters false positive, you'll see that we've got a rectangle around a number that, again, would make a pattern match in a TCP dump. Pretty much anybody on the phone that's responsible for sensitive data or about to be, this is the enemy. This is what is going to ruin everybody's existence, because what happens is you have to put human labor against it to validate this. Otherwise, it just becomes useless, and all of a sudden you have a process that's just not working. So the way that we manage it essentially is using that intellectual property of an AnyFind. We tend to get around a 2% false positive. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about how this turns into something a little bit bigger, and then I'm actually going to give a little bit of a live presentation where I can actually show you some things in action. Shane, go ahead and flip to the next slide, please. So if you look at this, this is a partial screenshot of the application. And so again, we're talking about the AnyFind. What we're doing is we're taking it up a level. So first we understand what an AnyFind is. It's a data type. In the case of the previous screen, it was a credit card number. But if you look here where you see the colored icons, you're going to see Social Security, credit card, password entry, bank account, driver's license, and so forth. Those are the data types that we've built out, which are the most common ones. So think of that as our first layer of accuracy. Now, the fascinating thing about the way we handle it is we're not just going to look for a Social Security number. Ultimately, an unformatted Social Security number that you find around a network or around your environment really is kind of worthless unless there's some contextual data around that, which is where we get into the proximity sensing. What makes a Social Security number valuable? What makes a credit card valuable is having information near that. Well, one of the cool things we can do is we can say, for example, you're in an environment where you are looking for employee information and making sure that's not crawling around the network, or you're in a HIPAA scenario or a student scenario. Take your pick. It doesn't really matter. One of the cool things we could do, if you look at the icons on the right-hand side where it says keyword regex and dictionary, what we can do is we can replicate existing algorithms. I'm going to use the example of maybe for sensitive document forms, or think of employee ID numbers. Well, if I find an employee ID number near a Social Security number, near date of birth, near personal address, and so forth, that is definitely where we start to get into a level of toxicity, right? So unformatted, sure, we can find them, not a high value target, but if we can start to map combinations of this sensitive data in a much more valuable manner, we can find that toxic data and we can actually manage it. So that's where the second layer of accuracy plays out. So an AnyFind is really just a data type that you guys don't need to worry about. You basically click the button, do a couple of zigs and zags, and the next thing you know, you're taking what is typically in the market around 20 to 30% false positives, which I'm sure some of you are already rolling your eyes because that's a very frustrating number, down to 2%. Think of your traditional, I joke about it being the dumpster fire network share that just about every organization has. It's where customer service is dumping documents, accounting is dumping documents. Well, if we do a search of that repository, we could potentially find 1 million bits of sensitive data in a first pass. Well, at 20 to 30% false positive, that translates into 200,000 to 300,000 wrong, inaccurate findings. And that's going to ruin somebody's day for basically several months. It's just not going to be valuable versus 2%. So that's where we can start getting into automation and some things that I'm not necessarily going to talk about today. But as we go into the product portion, which we're going to flip over here in a second, I want everybody to be aware that if you find stuff interesting that I show you, we can do a much deeper dive on a one-on-one demo with my team and some of the folks that work in your territory. So there's obviously the compliance side, which is really where Scott just absolutely shines. But ultimately, it's getting the data to be able to maintain that compliance. So let's jump in. I'm going to go ahead and show my screen now. So Shane, if you want to go ahead and just right-click on my name and pass that over.
I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with you, Frank. But in the meantime, we have a question.
Sure. What's the question?
So the question is, for HIPAA, there's a standard, the de-identification standard. And if we apply it, PII info would be protected. Do we have such standards for GDPR and PCI DSS?
That's going to be a Scott question.
Scott.
That is a Scott question. And for GDPR, definitely not. For PCI DSS, I would have to double check before I could say definitively. However, this is important. And I just, in fact, spoke to a reporter last week about this. He asked me this very same question. I would not rely on the de-identification standard in the medium to long term. And here's why. Here's the problem. You have two standards with de-identification. One is the expert opinion standard. One is simply removing the 18 fields you need to remove. Now, if those of you not involved with HIPAA, you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's these two different options. One is to say, have an expert come along and say, yes, you've de-identified the right things, you pulled the right things, this is an anonymized data set in my expert opinion. Other option is just to remove a bunch of fields, 18 in the case of HIPAA, and you're good to go. Problem is with the latter is that over time, big data is able to de-identify information that's seemingly innocuous. And so I really would caution everyone on this call to be very suspect of the de-identification standard that HIPAA has, because over time it's not going to wear well. Big data is essentially a tool that can do all kinds of things that would shock most of us. It really can help us look around corners and see things that really would be invisible otherwise. So that's a long way of saying don't rely on the de-identification standard over the long haul. It's just not worth it.
Thank you.
All right. So can you guys see my screen okay?
Yeah.
That's a big question. All right. So I want to start with a little bit of some custom stuff, because remember, when we're dealing with sensitive data, it's not just necessarily inside of the box of the standards, but again, my favorite is intellectual property. I definitely get a lot of calls around that because, sure, people want to maintain compliance, but there's always a set of internal regulations or internal governance rules trying to protect, IP. So in this case, and this is where I wanted to show a little bit of the combination work, I've put together a dictionary, and it's a custom dictionary. It's all kinds of fun stuff that you may or may not recognize, some of them being my favorite, like cloaking, defense, right? So depending on where you're working or what your organization is. So I've been able to actually load that dictionary inside of Spirion, and I'm going to pull up the application. And in this case, this is, again, it's a partial demo. I want to make that very, very clear. Most of Spirion can be run behind the scenes. So there is a central console, which I'm not going to cover today. And certainly there's a stealthy approach to all of what I'm doing. I'm just doing this for visual effects. So in this case, I have my data types loaded as a dictionary, but I've also got some additional AnyFinds, just like we saw in the screenshot for socials, credit cards, and so forth. And at that point, I'm just going to go ahead and do a run. So I have a target repository in place, and what we're looking at essentially is I'm getting a whole bunch of different matches based on those data types. And what you're seeing in real time here is, over 500 of the dictionary items, some email addresses, some personal addresses, probably not a lot of credit cards in this particular pass, but you get the general idea. We're literally just flying through this data. Total matches over 1,400 at this point. in just a second we'll be done. So this is fully interactive mode. It's going to be personal preference for you as far as what's in the best interest of your organization. But what I love to show is the fun stuff. So in this case, I was looking for a word, thin thread. Now, I can tell you I had a lot of fun finding data for today's webinar, and somehow or another I ran across a very interesting website. But ultimately, I found some declassified data. In this particular case, we can see that that document does actually have some sensitive information that matches. So how can I classify that? Well, I can simply right-click, or I can click up top here. In this case, we'll choose Classify, and I can manually intervene. So manually being one part of it. So to that question earlier of those human eyes, sure, if that's what you want to do, and you want to put human interaction against this, you're absolutely more than welcome to. We can go ahead and classify that. So let's just say that maybe we classify that as ITAR data. That sounds about right, considering that it has to do with thin thread. I can also take a quick look at the document. Now, the reason I want to show you this is because this is being run through our OCR engine. So the beauty of it, this is actually a PDF of a fax. It doesn't really get much worse than this other than handwriting. And you can see it's been redacted, and there's all kinds of fun blocks in here. But we were able to actually find the sensitive data. So if this was found on somebody's desktop, perhaps, when it shouldn't be there, that is one of the capabilities of product. Now, I've classified that. That's the first thing. So part one is the UI. This is, again, very, very interactive. I'm going to switch this to an automated side of things. So let me close that up, and we're going to use a different scenario. So in this case, the scenario is essentially the old network share, all right, where I've got a whole bunch of data. So that repository where everybody's just throwing things in, again, regardless of your organization. If you think you're immune from it, I've done enough conversations with enterprises, and I have seen it on every single call, except for somebody who's purely cloud, in which case we can also look at cloud repositories. But in this case, so I've got various types of documents. The first scenario is understanding there's two separate rules at play here. These are in a safe place. I've classified that pretty much as top secret. Same thing for some of these items. They've been classified appropriately. I'm going to take these documents. I'm going to move them to my laptop, as in I'm really tired. I've been working all week long. Nobody will notice. I'll just bring them home to work on them. At this point, we are invoking a tool called Sensitive Data Watcher. There is a completely different set of rules that are being enforced against my laptop versus enforcing those rules against that network repository. So what you're looking at is basically something's just occurred. In this case, that top secret document should have never been on my laptop. So what did we do? Well, in the simplest scenario, I've left them a love note telling them that PCI and PII data were discovered outside of an approved data repository, and a breach risk incident has been automatically documented for review in that centralized console that we're not looking at. Ultimately, they know they're going to get a tap on the shoulder and have a little bit of a conversation over a cup of coffee as to why they're putting sensitive data on their desktop. Other things, and this is where we're going to get a little bit deeper into some fun findings. I have a document here, and this, again, it's just real simple. If I right-click on it, I have a shell integration where I can actually do some quick actions via Spirion. I can look at classifications, but I want to show one level deeper into the actual classifications as they reside on the document. What we've done here is something we call persistent classification. In this case, what you see is I've got a whole, and obviously not nearly as refined of a schema as Scott suggests, but I do have some of the regulatory tags in here, or classifications, as well as my own personal stuff. So maybe this one falls under NYS Part 500, but there are social security numbers in here. I can multi-classify. So there isn't just a one-size-fits-all. We have a whole bunch of people on this call. I guarantee you that somebody is going, wait a minute, are you telling me that not only can I classify this as far as what regulations it falls under, but other stuff? The answer is absolutely. So I can say, yeah, that's a social security number. It's top secret. It falls under NYS Part 500 or ITAR. That is going to be entirely up to you, and it is fully customizable. There's no limit on this. The reason I'm pointing this out is because it now goes into a much more entertaining realm of persistent classifications. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We're going to jump right back to the slide because I need to explain something to make a little bit more sense, because some of you folks may not understand what a persistent classification is. So just remember, I've classified these. It's been done automatically. And if you walk away with anything beyond what Scott wants you to walk away with, just remember Spirion's really cool because it will save you a lot of time and effort. All right,
Frank, I
let's
have
go
a
ahead.
question for you.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. I have a question. If someone wants to check their whole environment with all the users that are in their network, whether they have sensitive data or not, is that possible with Spirion?
Yes, but I want to put some parentheses around what we're looking for is target data. So in other words, we're not an e-discovery tool, meaning we're not going to catalog every single document, but rather the stuff that's specifically targeted. In the case of the conversation today, we're talking about maintaining compliance, regulatory compliance. But I could have a completely different conversation around government secrets, if you will, and where we're only targeting that. I've worked with folks who could care less about the compliance, the human side, but rather they were primarily focused on protecting top secret information or information that was intellectual property purely for toxic for the organization. So the answer is yes, but we're not an e-discovery. I want to make sure that in case that's what they're thinking. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you.
All right, and then we can always expand on that on a one-on-one call if we need to get into more detail. I'd be more than happy to go through that and show them some cool things. So let me go ahead and pass it back to you. And what I want to do really is give you guys a quick lesson on metadata and why that's important to what we do and the value that we can expand upon. So if you can go ahead and fire your screen back up. All right, so let's jump into the next slide and let's talk about what happened. So you guys saw the visuals on the icons, you saw the pretty colors. Let's start with when we are using persistent classification inside of Spirion, we have plugins for the modern office documents. In this case, what you see in that blue box there on the left side is where those classifications that were automatically leveraged now show up as a banner inside of the document. I get questions all the time. Hey, can you guys watermark? Can we do this? Can we do that? Can we do the other thing? The answer is most likely yes, through either PowerShell scripts or other tools that we can invoke. But out of the box, if you just want to educate your employees and you just want to bring in awareness and have that start to mount a campaign, we can 100% do that through the banners inside of the tool. And what you can see here is this one is proprietary and sensitive. It falls under the C3 marker, but it also falls under GDPR, CCPA, and NYS Part 500. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait, that's a lot. Somebody actually brought the question up earlier. Scott answered it, and I'm going to expand on it and kind of clean up the perception that I have. And I love to use this scenario. I'm based in California, okay? So my company is headquartered in California. And 10 years ago, all we had to worry about was PCI, okay? We do business around the world. So we've covered ourselves, and again, let's use the scenario that we've covered ourselves for the PCI side by doing the search and finding the sensitive data. All of a sudden, some folks over on the other side of the pond decide they're going to put some regulations that are going to impact folks we do business with, GDPR. Well, instead of sitting there and reinventing the wheel, all we have to do is build another set of rules that cover what we're looking for as far as that GDPR umbrella goes. All of a sudden, California says, that GDPR thing's kind of cool. Hey, you know what? Let's start to put some things in place here in the States, at least in our state, where we can do that. Even if we can't do it federally, if you want to do business with us, you have to maintain that compliance and stay under that umbrella. Great. We add a few more rules in our search criteria. We now see that document qualifies for internal proprietary. It also qualifies for GDPR, maintaining under that umbrella, and CCPA. So the point and the takeaway that I want you guys to understand is that regardless of what you're facing, if you're looking for sensitive data and you need to classify it, we can definitely help you, and we can grow along with the challenges that you face in your environment. That's the visuals there. All right, let's go to the next slide unless there's any questions on this.
Yes, there actually is. Is the Spirion tool agent-based?
It is. We're an agent-based tool. We can do remote searches. So there's a little bit of technical minutia, but the short answer is it's highly configurable. Whenever I say agent and whenever somebody asks agent, I am sure you are thinking back to the late 90s when a couple of antivirus tools ruined the world for everybody in IT. We are not a heavy agent. We can reduce it down to 2 cores, low I/O, but we are indeed an agent-based technology, and there are some search strategies that we can put in place to limit the level of deployment. But if you're concerned, if you've got 500 folks in customer service and accounting, and you're concerned about what they put on their desktops, the reality is you're going to want to use the agent on those desktops. But we can thin it out for you. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so metadata lesson. So this is a tool called the EXIF tool. It's a freebie. If you look up at the very top there, you'll actually see the name of it, EXIF tool. But it's a command line tool. You take a file, you drop it on here, and it actually reads back all the metadata. I've got two arrows. The bottom arrow, you can see it's pointing to the lower highlighted line where it says NYS Part 500, and then it's piped to proprietary and sensitive, piped GDPR, CCPA. So those are the classification names. The top line, those are the classification GUIDs that are part of the Spirion system. Metadata is like, the easiest way to say it is it's like a mini database that is attached to most modern file types. So what that means is that this will follow the file. So you have a file in a repository, you tag it, you say, yep, that's classified as X, Y, and Z for your business unit or your organization. It sticks with it. The benefit to this is we can plug those GUIDs into your next-gen firewalls. And I'm going to name drop just because I have a couple of fan favorites, Palo Alto, Cisco, you got Fortinet, anything that can read and do DPI capable inspections of file content can now do your blocking and tackling. So Spirion can actually augment pre-existing infrastructure tools, which I'm sure most of you have in place. The other thing is, while Scott had outlined, we're not a DLP in the sense that you guys might have come on this call thinking, because our focus is on one area, sensitive data, finding it, managing it. The cool part is, if you have a DLP in place, maybe you have a tool that is letting you down and not really being very accurate, but it's DPI capable, we can feed a lot of our information into those tools and augment them and raise the accuracy. So if you already have something that's like a data in motion tool, but it's not very accurate, or you're having challenges with it, there are almost always a way that we can enhance those tools with what we do. We are very specialized in finding that data. All right, so that's what metadata is. That's what it really looks like in the real world. Go ahead and pop. I think we have one more slide here to just talk about. Oh, no, okay, that's back to Scott. So any questions on metadata before Scott jumps in and wraps up?
No questions.
Okay, fabulous, Frank. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right. So I'm going to wrap this up here with some examples of how this works in practice. And if there's more questions, we'll take them. If not, then we'll wrap up here. What you're seeing before you, protection of intellectual property. I mentioned several times here about how important trade secrets are, and that once they're gone, they're gone. There's no way to unring the bell. What you're looking at here on the right side of the screen is the indictment against Huawei, against specifically the folks that stole information from T-Mobile. T-Mobile sued Huawei a couple of years ago and won in civil court. But also there is the Economic Espionage Act as well, which you're seeing here, and this was handed down early in January of this year. So why am I saying this? When I'm saying this is that it's so important to identify intellectual property. That way, whenever there is some kind of transgression, whether it's in a civil or criminal or other context, you're going to be able to identify all the documentation that is subject to trade secrets or other protections of intellectual property. Perhaps it's an agreement, we'll say, and that you're able to find those very quickly and get an idea of where they are, what kind of protections they have, and what's their journey been. When did they get into the organization? Where have they traveled? Who has touched them, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have all that information so that when there is this kind of investigation, you're going to be able to have the right answers. And so part of those right answers are going to come from your data classification system, and hence why we're having our presentation here today. If you go to the next slide, there's another aspect to this, and this is export controls. This is something I spent a lot of time working on at a defense contractor, and it's ferociously complex, probably the most complex area of law I've ever dealt with. And it's easy to get into trouble. They have this idea of tech data and technology, and tech data can be just about anything that's supporting a defense contract. Even information about the contract itself is tech data. And aerospace industry, defense industry, very vulnerable to this kind of stuff. So being able to identify that certain documents are subject to ITAR or the EAR, or they have DFARS requirements or what have you, having this embedded in a document is huge as part of what's called a technology control program. Those of you that work at defense contractors or their subsidiaries, probably well versed with TCPs already. This is an intimate part of that. Let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to wrap things up here. So here are the conclusions that I want you to leave with. Data discovery and classification, probably the most cost-effective tool for promoting information security and privacy we have at the moment. There's just really no other way to do what we're doing here. Data protection regulations apply globally. What's interesting is that New York Shield Act just came down last Thursday, And it applies to basically anyone on the planet. It doesn't have to necessarily be a corporation. It could be a nonprofit institution. It could be an individual, and potentially applies to anyone on the planet. It does not have to be simply someone in New York or in the US. So the way it's written, it has a global application. That's becoming a fairly common phenomenon for data protection laws. And so data discovery, it's as much a political process as a technical one. Someone asked earlier about the subjectivity of determining what is sensitive and whether humans can only 100% can be done by humans. The shorter answer is that yes, but it's still intimately political process. And so you're going to find that this will merit some kind of a committee to determine, well, what gets qualified as class 3 versus class 4. And so it's extraordinarily political, but that's part of the process. So what do you need? You need an executive sponsor, someone to essentially be the, I guess, promoter, if you will, for this whole project, this whole system, someone that's going to champion it. You need a steering committee, like I was on, to make sure that you're getting the right people at the table and they're putting in the right information for the data classification matrix. You need subcommittees for doing the hard lifting of what gets done, for example, what kind of data encryption standard is going to be used, etc. And because you're putting a lot of thought into it up front, you're going to get a lot of benefits down the road. Sometimes I call data discovery and classification a force multiplier. And I do that because whenever your data classification labels are embedded in everything, then systems like your DLP or next-gen firewall or anything that can read metadata for that matter is going to have the intelligence it needs to do its job a lot better. Sometimes I say that our technology is brains for DLP. That's the reason. I want to leave it open there. Frank, do you have any conclusions or recommendations or any wrapping comments before we wrap up? We've got 3 minutes left.
The only thing I'd like to say is, again, if anybody wants to dig into the technology, if they have a gazillion questions and maybe they weren't comfortable, ask them today. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to do some one-on-ones, answer the questions. Same thing for Scott. If you guys have any questions for him, he'd be more than happy to help you out. We're very approachable, so don't sweat it. Just give us a buzz and we'll get with you and some of your challenges sorted out and get you going in the right direction.
Wonderful. Shane, if you go to the next slide, I think that's our questions. If there are any remaining questions, we'll answer them. If not, then we'll put up our contact information.
Please remember, you can type in your questions on the console. It doesn't look like we have any more questions.
All right, then in that case, why don't we throw up the final slide with our contact information on there. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Frank, for that presentation. That was awesome. And Shane, we're going to send it back over to you.
All right, so thanks everybody for joining. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a link to the recorded webinar will be provided via email in the next coming days. And we hope to see you at any of our future webinars. And thanks again. You guys have a great day.